Hi everyone, and welcome to Trains Are Awesome. We're the place to be for train trip reports and other public transport related content from around the world. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and check out some of the other videos we've made. Now if you know me, you'll know that I love trains from almost every country. But there's one country whose trains hold a special place in my heart, and that place is Japan. Of course, part of this has to do with me growing up there and spending 10 years riding the trains there. Oh, look at baby me. But whether you've been to Japan or not many people disagree with the fact that Tokyo, the capital of Japan, has one of the world's best transit systems. What makes Tokyo's system so awesome? Well, check out this video I made about that a few years ago. If you want a better understanding of how the system in Tokyo works, I have a video for that too. The links to both videos are in the description. If it wasn't obvious before, it's obvious now. I like the trains in Tokyo. Now in this video though, I won't be explaining how the network works or the many attributes that make it great. Today I'm discussing two of its most unique features, and I argue the features that make it such a smart system. So what is this greatest feature of the Tokyo train system? I've broken it down into two parts, a loop line and subway through service. First, let's talk about how railway lines can best serve commuters. Traditionally, trains have moved people from suburbs into the center of the city. We see this model all over the world, Tokyo included. One thing, for example, the Netherlands does well is their central stations. Trains from all different directions tend to converge at one central station, which is usually close to the cultural or business center of the city, except for in a few cases. And no shade to the country that I was born in and went to high school in, but the Netherlands doesn't really have metropolises like New York, Tokyo, or Paris. Speaking of Paris, here's the biggest pain of their transit system. The City of Lights has not one, but 6 or 7 main train stations, depending on how you count. Trains from different regions in France terminate at different stations in Paris. To transfer, you have to take the metro from one terminus to the other. The metro you take depends on your start and end points, and as you can imagine, you have to be pretty metro savvy to transfer in Paris. London has the same problem, but with 14 of these stations. And once again, the tube is available for transfers. The circle line can be especially convenient, but honestly, this is crazy. And believe it or not, Tokyo actually has a very similar system to London or Paris. There are a few terminal stations scattered around the outer rim of central Tokyo. These include the famous Shinjuku, the busiest train station in the world, as well as stations like Shibuya, Shinagawa, Hamamatsucho, Tokyo, Akihabara, Asakusa, Ueno, and Ikebukuro. Both JR lines, which are formerly the National Railway Company but has since been privatized, and other major private railway companies, come from all over the greater Tokyo area and terminate at one of these terminal stations. But Tokyo actually has a solution to connect these stations. Behold the Yamanote Line. I doubt there's a single person who lives in Tokyo that doesn't know the Yamanote Line. And it's a pretty well-known line even outside of Japan. That's because it's so ingenious. The Yamanote Line is a loop line that just continuously runs circles around central Tokyo, stopping at all but one of the major terminal stations I mentioned earlier. The 11-car trains run at 2 to 5 minute intervals in both directions, taking precisely an hour to complete the 30-station loop. The Yamanote Line makes transfers from one line to the other easier, and it makes the train a more realistic option even if your job isn't located near the terminus of the line that you live on. The Yamanote Line is operated by JR East Japan, a company that was formed after the Japanese national railways were dissolved in the 1980s. Many JR lines actually use tracks parallel to the Yamanote Line, so they too can serve more than one terminal station in Tokyo and relieve some of the insane congestion on the Yamanote Line. However, there's only one JR line that actually cuts through the middle of this loop line, so what if your job is in central Tokyo, inside the Yamanote Line? Well, transferring to one of Tokyo's 13 metro lines is always an option, of course. But the railway companies have come up with a solution that gets rid of the need to change trains. What we get is a form of interlining, something I will now refer to as through service from this point on. In order to discuss this, we need another global perspective, this time on the distinction between trains and subways. In Europe, for whatever reason, some rail fans can get pretty heated up if you dare mention anything about urban transport. They are treated as entirely separate things. And looking at the trains, I can imagine why some people would feel that way. Mainline trains in Europe are big and fast. Metros are smaller, stop more. They run on third rail, big trains have overhead wires. Looking at the US, we see that mainline trains absolutely dwarf European trains. An Amtrak Superliner is absolutely massive, and so are commuter rail trains. And yeah, some metros like the DC Metro are pretty big too, but looking at the L or the PATH, these trains are definitely a different scale. Once again, third rail versus overhead wires, or in most cases, diesel. And get this, in some American cities, subways and other rail systems don't even share stations. So Union Station in Chicago has no L train stopping at it. Penn Station has a subway stop close by, but it's not called Penn Station. Anyways, this is very different in Tokyo. It's hardly possible to make any distinction between subway trains and commuter trains. They have the same gauge, use the same overhead wires, and commuter trains are very, very metro-like. 4 doors per car per side, longitudinal seating, short distances between stations, and frequency so high that after living there, I am now spoiled for life and end up disappointed anywhere else I go. Basically, what other countries would call a metro, Japan would call commuter rail. Or a metro, or, well, it just depends on the line really. Why is this? Is this for confusion's sake? No, it's for compatibility. Mainline trains and subway line trains look the same because they run on the same lines. Let's take this train running from the suburbs into the cities. All the people on the train want to go into the city, but the line ends at the edge of the city center. However, the tracks of our line are connected to the tracks of a subway line. And when we reach the end of our line, the drivers switch and our train continues underground into the city. The people get off, new people get on, and on the other side of town we switch drivers again. The train continues on yet another company's tracks into the suburbs on the other side. To use an American example, this would be like VRE commuter trains from Virginia running onto the Washington Metro Rail tracks in DC, then running back onto a MARC line in Maryland. This is different from how European trains work, since none of the train operating companies in Europe actually own the tracks they run on. I can think of a few international examples. There are AKN trains in Hamburg, Germany that run onto the city's S-Bahn system a few times a day. Paris's RER trains run on both SNCF tracks and tracks owned by the Paris Metro operator, though I don't know if the driver changes here. And then there's South Shore lines that run onto the Metro Electric District. So yeah, there's a few examples from different parts of the world, but Tokyo area does it most, and it does it best. Through service has greatly improved access from the suburbs into the city. Let's break down all the connections that this has made possible. The Tobu SkyTree line, named after the super tall tower, starts at Asakusa Station. This Cape Gauge network is actually the longest of any Tokyo area private railway companies, stretching out all the way to Isezaki in Gunma Prefecture or the popular tourist town of Nikko in Tochigi Prefecture. There are even connections all the way into Fukushima Prefecture. At Kitasenju Station in the north of Tokyo, all station local trains run onto the Tokyo Metro Hibiya line, stopping at important districts like Ueno, Ginza, Kasumigaseki, Roppongi, and Ebisu, before terminating at Nakameguro. Tokyo Metro and Tobu Railway actually placed a joint order for 7-car trains, and so Tokyo Metro 13,000 series and Tobu 70,000 series run on this connection. But wait, there's more. Express trains on the SkyTree line connect to a different Tokyo Metro line. At Hikifune Station, 2 stops before the terminus of Asakusa, Express trains diverge from the line and head towards Oshiage, where they connect to the Hanzomon line. Trains continue to major interchange station Otemachi, then Aoyama Ichome and Shibuya stations, and here they share platforms with yet another company, Tokyu Railway. And all trains continue onto the Den-en-Toshi line, which goes out to Chuo-Rinkan in Kanagawa Prefecture. In fact, the depot for the Hanzomon line is actually located on the Den-en-Toshi line. Tobu 50,050 trains are reserved for these services, and all Hanzomon line and Den-en-Toshi line trains can run on this connection. Next, let's look at the JR Chuo line. This is a Cape Gauge long-distance line between Tokyo and Nagoya, but within Tokyo city limits, there is a rapid service and a local service. The rapid service terminates at Tokyo Station, while the local service branches off and becomes the Sobu line, once again being a local service parallel to a separate rapid service. The Tokyo Metro Tozai line, literally meaning the east-west line, connects to the Chuo-Sobu line on both ends at Nakano and Nishifunabashi stations. It acts as a bypass and passengers can take either route. However, both JR and Tokyo Metro use blue-colored trains for trains running on the Tozai line, while JR uses yellow-colored trains for trains sticking to the JR route. At Nishifunabashi, the Tozai line is also connected to the Toyo Rapid Railway, which continues into Katsudai City. The JR Joban line is another long-distance Cape Gauge line from Sendai past the east coast into Ueno Station in Tokyo. There are a few trains that travel the whole line, but most trains terminate somewhere between Toride and Mito stations. All trains to and from Ueno act as rapid trains between Kitasenju and Toride. Separate trains on separate tracks once again are used for local trains, and these all connect to the Tokyo Metro Chiyoda line. The Chiyoda line runs through Otemachi, Kasumigaseki, and Omotesando before connecting to the Odakyu line at Yoyogi Uehara. The Odakyu line goes all the way to Odawara, near Mount Fuji, but Chiyoda line trains run as far as Isehara. The unique thing here is that there is a direct train between a private railway and a JR line, and you can ride a JR E233 series train on the Odakyu line, or an Odakyu 4000 series on the Joban line. Even cooler, Odakyu runs some of its Romancecar limited express trains onto the Chiyoda line. This is unique even for Japan. These sleek 60,000 series Romancars only stop at 4 stations on the Chiyoda line and connect Kitasenju with many of the resort towns on the Odakyu line, like Hakone and Enoshima. Next, let's look at the Tobu Tojo line and, my absolute favorite, the Seibu Ikebukuro line. Both start west of Tokyo at Yori and Chichibu respectively. The Tojo line runs through the popular tourist town of Kawagoe, and the Seibu line passes through Tokorozawa City. Both run to the Ikebukuro terminus on the Yamanote Line, but before reaching Ikebukuro, connect to the Tokyo Metro Yurakucho line. The Yurakucho line also stops at Ikebukuro, which I think is kind of funny, but then continues to Iidabashi, Yurakucho, Toyosu, and Shinkiba. In 2008, the Fukutoshin line opened as Tokyo's newest subway. It shares the first 6 stations with the Yurakucho line, and the 2 lines share rolling stock. Tojo line and Seibu line trains also connect to the Fukutoshin line, which offers convenient access to Shinjuku and Shibuya. In 2013, the Fukutoshin line was connected to Tokyu Railway's Toyoko line. The Toyoko line runs to Yokohama, and so now you can take a train from the western suburbs in Saitama through central Tokyo, past the southern suburbs into central Yokohama. Even crazier, at Yokohama, the Toyoko line connects to the Yokohama Subway Minatomirai line, so a single train can travel on commuter rail, subway, commuter rail, then subway again. And the only people who might not be happy with this connection are Hibiya line passengers, since they used to enjoy through service with the Toyoko line before 2013. They still have cross-platform transfer though, so they don't have it that bad. A branched line of the Tokyu-Toyoko line is the Tokyu-Meguro line. Trains start at Hiyoshi, and it branches off towards Meguro Station instead of Shibuya. All trains continue on either the Toei Mita line or the Tokyo Metro Namboku line. These two lines share tracks for the first 3 stations until they split off and head north on different paths. The Namboku line at the north connects to the Saitama Rapid Railway line as well. In March 2023, both the Toyoko line and the Meguro line will connect to the Sagami Railway line through a brand new connection that's being built. This will mean that 8 railway companies will all connect to each other. A new record. The Keio line is the first non-Cape gauge line we're discussing. Instead, it has the weird 1372mm Scottish gauge. This is to enable through service with the Toei Shinjuku line. By the way, Toei in front of a name means that it's run by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government instead of Tokyo Metro, which is a private company. The Keio line runs from Hashimoto, Takao, and Hachioji to Shinjuku Station. From Sasazuka Station, a new underground connection was built beneath the old main line to connect with the Toei Shinjuku line platforms. Thus, Keio line trains from Takao and Hashimoto can run to Ichigaya, Morishita, and Motoyawata in Ichikawa City. Finally, there's the most interesting connection in my opinion. The Keisei main line connects Ueno and Nippori stations in Tokyo with Narita Airport through different cities in Chiba. It is also connected to the Hokuso Line, Chiba Newtown Railway, Narita Sky Access Line, and the Shibayama Railway Line, so it's a pretty sizable network on its own. But from Aoto Station, a branch line heads down to Oshiage where it connects to the Toei Asakusa Line. The Asakusa Line was actually the first subway in Tokyo to introduce this concept of through service. At Sengakuji, the Asakusa Line connects to the Keikyu Line, which runs into Yokohama and to Haneda Airport. That's right, thanks to the Asakusa Line, trains can run from Narita Airport all the way to Haneda Airport. There's a few examples of railway companies that operate through services with each other rather than with a subway line. Tobu runs limited express trains from Nikko onto the JR line into Shinjuku, since none of its subway connections serve this area of Tokyo. An interesting case is the JR Saikyo line. These trains start in Kawagoe, go through major interchanges Omiya and Akabane, and then connect to the Yamanote Line at Ikebukuro. Until Osaki, they run parallel to the Yamanote Line and act as an express service. Then, at Osaki, trains go one of 2 directions. One is the Rinkai Line. What shall we say about the Rinkai Line? It's weird, it's expensive to ride, it's not part of the subway system, but it does run underground for almost all its route. It's not a JR line, but the majority of trains are JR trains. Saikyo Line trains continue onto the Rinkai Line to Shinkiba Station. The Rinkai Line is scheduled to receive a branch line to Haneda Airport, which I expect will be a popular connection. Other Saikyo Line trains continue to Musashi Kosugi Station. After performing a series of maneuvers over freight lines, they then enter the brand new tunnel that connects them to the Sotetsu line. If that's too much information to remember, here's a good way to tell if there's a through service on a map. On most metro maps, JR lines are given a white and black dashed line, and other companies have a thin gray line to represent their lines. If either of these are highlighted in the color of one of the metro lines, it means that there's a through service. Finally, let's discuss a few negatives of this through service. 1. It complicates services and allows for delays. The less isolated a system is, the more susceptible it is to delays that can ripple along the larger network. But remember, this is still Japan, where punctuality is everything. 2. It complicates remembering and wayfinding. The more connections are offered, the harder it is for people who aren't as into trains to remember which trains they can take to where. Fortunately, Tokyo is very good at signage, both inside trains and at stations, even in English these days. And 3, I once had a professor who told me that as a student, she always enjoyed boarding a train at its origin station. This way, she was guaranteed a seat. But because most trains now come from a subway line, they are already carrying passengers, and your chances of a seat are less likely. In my personal opinion, though, the benefits of this through service greatly outweigh these caveats. That was a lot of information for one video, but I think these are some of the coolest, if not most convenient features of the Tokyo transit system. I love the trains in Tokyo, and I love trains in general. And my hope is that through my videos, you'll feel encouraged to travel by train too. Please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome, and we'll see you next time.